straight. Um, let's see. I think today I want to start with 1984. Some point this time, or some point later, I'll read the Bible and do. I want to be able to like make him like, maybe doing like every Friday or something. Actually, I think I said in my goal video that I wanted to read all 4 books like over the summer. Something tells me reading all 4 books like in parts is not gonna work. But that's it. I think as I said before, that I think I'll read books like straight, like Blood Meridian. I think it's one of the shorter books, and I'm considering reading that book just straight like, I don't know, like 3-hour video or something like that. So possibly I'll be able to do that. Anyway, today I want to start on 1984. That, pretty small book. I've heard stories about this book. I think they have a show on Netflix, I think. I don't know. Oh, anyway, let's get started. It's a novel by George Orwell with an afterword by Erich Fromm. I don't know. Okay, let's see. Let me see what like the sec. God. There's more parts to this than I thought. I thought it just says 1 and there's like a giant 2 on the one of the pages. How many pages is this? 101 pages or 104 pages for book 1. And there's 2, 3. So it's gonna be a long book, right? I'll read like to this part, which is 2 and 20. I'll just read 20 pages. That's a good chunk. Anyway. 1. It was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass door of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster too large for indoor display had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face more than a meter wide, the face of a man of about 45 with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying to lift. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. Inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque like a dulled mirror which formed part of the surface of the right-hand wall. Winston turned the switch and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen, it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window, a smallish, frail figure the meagerness of his body merely emphasized by the blue overalls, which were the uniform of the party. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades in the cold of the winter that had just ended. Outside, even through the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down in the street, little eddies of wind were whirling dust and torn paper into spirals, and though the sun was shining in the sky a harsh blue, there seemed to be no color in anything except the posters that were plastered everywhere. The black mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one on the house front immediately opposite Big Brother's watching you, the caption said. While the dark eyes looked deep into Winston's own, down at street level another poster, torn at one corner, flapped fitfully in the wind, alternately covering and uncovering the single word, INGSOC. In the far distance, a helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a blue bottle, and darted away again with a curving flight. It was the police patrol, snooping into people's windows. The patrols did not matter, however, only the thought police mattered. Behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen was still babbling away about pig iron and the overfulfillment of the 9th three-year plan. The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper would be picked up by it. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment, how often, or on what system. The thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everyone all the time. But at any rate, they would plug in your wire wherever they wanted to. You had to did live, from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. Winston kept his back turned to the telescreen. It was safer, though, as he well knew even a back can be revealing. A kilometer away, the Ministry of Truth, his place of work, towered vast and white above the grimy landscape. This, he thought, was a sort of vague distaste. This was London, chief city of Airstrip 1, itself the third most populous of the provinces of Oceania. He tried to squeeze out some childhood memories that should tell him whether London had always been quite like this. Were there always these vistas of rotting 19th century houses, their sides shored up with balks of timber, their windows patched with cardboard and their roofs with corrugated iron, their crazy garden walls sagging in all directions, and the bomb sites where the plaster dust swirled in the air and the willow herb straggled over the heaps of rubble, in the places where the bombs had cleared a large path and there had sprung up sordid colonies of wooden dwellings like chicken houses. But it was no use. He could not remember. Nothing remained of his childhood except a series of bright-lit table locks occurring against no background and mostly unintelligible. Oh, yeah. The Ministry of Truth, Minitrue, and Newspeak was startlingly different from any other object in sight. It was an enormous pyramidal structure of glittering white concrete soaring up, terrace after terrace, 300 meters into the air. From where Winston stood, it was just possible to read. Picked out on his white face in elegant lettering, the three slogans of the party: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. The Ministry of Truth contained, it was said, 3,000 rooms above ground level and corresponding ramifications below. Scattered about London, there was just 3 other buildings of similar appearance and size. So completely did they dwarf the surrounding architecture that from the roof of Victoria Mansions, you could see all 4 of them simultaneously. They were the homes of the 4 ministries between which the entire apparatus of government was divided. The Ministry of Truth, which concerned itself with news, entertainment, education, and the fine arts. The Ministry of Peace, which concerned itself with war. The Ministry of Love, which maintained law and order. And the Ministry of Plenty, which was responsible for economic affairs. Their names in Newspeak: Many True, Many Pax, Many Love, and Many Plenty. The Ministry of Love was the really frightening one. There was no windows in it at all. Winston had never been inside the Ministry of Love, nor within half a kilometer of it. It was a place impossible to enter except on official business, and it could then only by penetrating through a maze of barbed wire entanglements, steel doors, and hidden machine gun nests. Even the streets leading up to its outer barriers were roamed by gorilla-faced guards in black uniforms armed with jointed truncheons. And there's a side note here. It says Newspeak was the official language of Oceania for an account of its structure and etymology. See appendix. I'm assuming the appendix on the end. Okay, back. Winston turned abruptly. He had set his features into the expressions of quiet optimism which it was advisable to wear when facing the telescreen. He crossed the room into the tiny kitchen. By leaving the ministry at this time of day, he had sacrificed his lunch in the canteen, and he was aware that there was no food in the kitchen except a hunk of dark-colored bread which gotta be saved for tomorrow's breakfast. He took down from the shelf a bottle of odorless liquid with a plain white label marked Victory Gin. It gave off a sickly, oily smell, as of Chinese rice spirit. Winston poured out nearly a teacupful, served himself for a shock, and gulped it down like a dose of medicine. Instantly his face turned scarlet and the water ran out of his eyes. The stuff was like nitric acid, and moreover, in swallowing it, one had the sensation of being hit on the back of the head with a rubber club. The next moment, however, the burning in his belly died down and the world began to look more cheerful. He took a cigarette from a crumpled packet marked Victory Cigarettes and incautiously held it upright, whereupon the tobacco fell on the floor. With the next, he was more successful. He went back to the living room and sat down at a small table that stood to the left of the telescreen. From the table drawer, he took out a pen holder, a bottle of ink, and a thick quarto-sized blank book with a red back and a marble cover. For some reason, the telescreen in the living room was in an unusual position. Instead of being placed as was normal in the end wall where it could command the whole room, it was in the longer wall, opposite the window. To one side of it, there was a shallow alcove in which Winston was now sitting, and which, when the flats were built, had probably been intended to hold bookshelves. By sitting in the alcove and keeping well back, Winston was able to remain outside the range of the telescreen so far as sight went. Alright, let me stop right there. I'm gonna get water. Refreshing. Alright. He could be heard, of course, but as long as he stayed in his present position, he could not be seen. It was partly the unusual geography of the room that had suggested to him the thing that he was now about to do. But it had also been suggested by the book that he had just taken out of the drawer. It was a peculiar, beautiful book. A smooth, creamy paper, a little yellowed by age, was of a kind that had not been manufactured for at least 40 years past. He could guess, however, that the book was much older than that. He had seen it lying in the window of a frowsy little junk shop in the slummy quarter of the town. Just what quarter he did not now remember, and had been stricken immediately by an overwhelming desire to possess it. Party members were supposed not to go into ordinary shops dealing on the free market, it was called. But the rule was not strictly kept, because there were various things such as shoelaces and razor blades which was impossible to get a hold of any other way. He had given a quick glance up and down the street and then had slipped inside and bought the book for $2.50. At the time, he was not conscious of wanting it for any particular purpose. He had he had carried it guiltily home in his briefcase, even with nothing written on in it. It was a compromising possession. The thing that he was about to do was open a diary. This was not illegal. Nothing was illegal since there were no longer any laws. But if detected, it was reasonably certain that it would be punished by death or at least by 25 years in a forced labor camp. Winston fitted a nib into the pen holder and sucked in to get the grease off. The pen was an archaic instrument, seldom used even for signatures, and he had procured one, furtively with some difficulty, simply because of a feeling that the beautiful creamy paper deserved to be written on with a real nib instead of being scratched with an ink pencil. Actually, he was not used to writing by hand. Apart from very short notes, it was usual to dictate everything into the speakwrite, which was of course impossible for his present purpose. He dipped the pen into the ink and then faltered for just a second. A tremor had gone through his bowels. To mark the paper was the decisive act. In small clumsy letters, he wrote, April 4th, 1984. He sat back. A sense of complete helplessness had descended upon him. To begin with, he did not know with any certainty that this was 1984. It must be round about that date, since he was fairly sure that his age was 39, and he believed that he had been born in 1944 or 1945. But it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two. For whom? It suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary? For the future? For the unborn? His mind hovered for a moment round the doubtful date on the page, and then fetched up with a bump against the new speak word, doublethink. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him. How could you communicate with the future? It was of its nature impossible. Either the future would resemble the present, in which case it would not listen to him, or it would be different from it, and his predicament would be meaningless. For some time he sat gazing stupidly at the paper. The telescreen had changed over to strident military music. It was curious that he seemed not merely to have lost the power of expressing himself, but even to have forgotten what it was that he had originally intended to say. For weeks past, he had been making ready for this moment, and had never crossed his mind that anything would be needed except courage. The actual writing would be easy. All he had to do was transfer to paper the interminable, restless monologue that had been running inside his head literally for years. At this moment, however, even the monologue had dried up. Moreover, his varicose ulcer had begun itching unbearably. He dared not scratch it, because if he did so, it always became inflamed. The seconds were ticking by. He was conscious of nothing except the blankness of the page in front of him, the itching of the skin above his ankle, the blaring of the music, and a slight wooziness caused by the gin. Suddenly he began writing in sheer panic, only imperfectly aware of what he was setting down. His small but childish handwriting struggled up and down the page, shedding first his capital letters and finally even his full stops. Let me get a water break real quick. I'm reading a lot. Alright, now we're getting to what he's writing. April 4th, 1984. Last night to the flicks, all war films, one very good one of a ship full of refugees being bombed somewhere in the Mediterranean. Audience much amused by shots of a great huge fat man trying to swim away with a helicopter after him. First you saw him wallowing along in the water like a porpoise, then you saw him through the helicopter gun sights. Then he was full of holes, and the sea round him turned pink, and he sank as suddenly as though the holes had let in the water. Audiences shouting with laughter when he sank. Then you saw a lifeboat full of children with a helicopter hovering over it. There was a middle-aged woman, might not have been Jewish, sitting up in the bow with a little boy about 3 years old in her arms. Little boy screaming with fright and hiding his head between her breasts as if he was trying to burrow right into her, and the woman putting her arms around him and comforting him, although she was blue with fright herself. All the time covering him up as much as possible, as she thought her arms could keep the bullets off him. Then the helicopter planted a 20-kilo bomb in among them. Terrific flash, and the boat went all to matchwood. Then there was a wonderful shot of a child's arm going up, right up into the air. A helicopter with a camera in its nose must have followed it up, and there was a lot of applause from the party seats, but a woman down in the part of the house suddenly started kicking up a fuss and shouting they didn't order of showed it not in front of the kids. They didn't it ain't right, not in front of kids. It ain't until the police turn her out. I don't suppose anything happened to her. Nobody cares what the pros say. Typical pros reaction, they never. Winston stopped writing, partly because he was suffering from cramp. He did not know what had made him pour out this stream of rubbish. But the curious thing was that while he was doing so, a totally different memory had clarified itself in his mind to the point where he almost felt equal to writing it down. It was he now realized, because of this other incident, that he had suddenly decided to come home and began the diary today. It had happened the morning at the ministry, if anything so nebulous could be said to happen. It was nearly 1100, and in the records department where Winston worked, they were dragging the chairs out of the cubicles and grouping them in the center of the hall, opposite the big telescreen, in preparation for the 2 minutes hate. Winston was just taking his place in one of the middle rows when two people whom he knew by sight but had never spoken to came unexpectedly into the room. One of them was a girl whom he often passed in the corridors. He did not know her name, but he knew that she worked in the fiction department. Presumably, since he had sometimes seen her with oily hands and carrying a spanner, she had some mechanical job on one of the novel writing machines. She was a bold-looking girl of about 27, with thick dark hair, a freckled face, and swift athletic movements. A narrow scarlet sash, emblem of the Junior Anti-Sex League, was wound several times around the waist of her overalls, just tightly enough to bring out the shaped lines of her hips. Winston had disliked her from the very first moment of seeing her. He knew the reason. It was because of the atmosphere of hockey fields and cold baths and community hikes and general clean-mindedness which she managed to carry about with her. He disliked nearly all women, and especially the young and pretty ones. It was always the women, and above all the young ones, who were the most bigoted adherents of the party, the swallowers of slogan, the amateur spies and nosers out of unorthodoxy. But this particular girl gave him the impression of being more dangerous than most. Once when they passed in the corridors, she had given him a quick sidelong glance which seemed to pierce right into him, and for a moment had filled him with black terror. The idea had even crossed his mind that she might be an agent of the thought police. That it was true was very unlikely. Still, he continued to feel peculiar uneasiness, which had fear mixed up in it as well as hostility, whenever she was anywhere near him. The other person was a man named O'Brien, a member of the inner party and holder of some post so important and remote that Wilson had only a dim idea of its nature. A momentary hush passed over the group of people round the chairs as they saw the black overalls of an inner party member approaching. O'Brien was a large, burly man with a thick neck and a coarse, humorous, brutal face. In spite of his formidable appearance, he had certain charms of manner. He had a trick of resettling his spectacles on his nose, which was curiously disarming, in some indefinable way, curiously civilized. It was a gesture which, if anyone had still thought in such terms, might have recalled an 18th century nobleman offering his snuff box. Winston has seen O'Brien perhaps a dozen times in almost as many years. He felt deeply drawn to him, not solely because he was intrigued by the contrast between O'Brien's urbane manner and his prize fighter's physique. Much more, it was because of a secretly held belief, or perhaps not even a belief, merely a hope, that O'Brien's political orthodoxy was not perfect. Something in his face suggested irresistibly, and again perhaps it was not even unorthodoxy that was put in his face, but simply intelligence. But at any rate, he had the appearance of being a person that you could talk to. If somehow you could cheat the telescreen and get him alone, Winston had never made the smallest effort to verify this guess. Indeed, there was no way of doing so. At this moment, O'Brien glanced at his wristwatch, saw that it was nearly 1100, and evidently decided to stay in the records department until the 2-minute hate was over. He took a chair in the same row as Winston, a couple places away. A small sandy-haired woman who worked in the next cubicle to Winston was between them. The girl with dark hair was sitting immediately behind. The next moment, a hideous grinding screech, as of some monstrous machine running without oil, burst from the big telescreen at the end of the room. It was noise that set one's teeth on edge and bristled the hair at the back of one's neck. The hate had started. Ooh, this is a big book, alright. As usual, the face of Emmanuel Goldstein, the enemy of the people, had flashed onto the screen. There were hisses here and there among the audience. The light, sandy-haired woman gave a squeak of mingled fear and disgust. Goldstein was the renegade and backslider who once, long ago, how long ago, nobody quite remembered, had been one of the leading figures of the party, almost on a level with Big Brother himself, and then had engaged in counter-evolutionary activities, had been condemned to death, and had mysteriously escaped and disappeared. The program of the 2-minute hate varied from day to day, but there was none in which Goldstein was not the principal figure. He was the primal traitor, the earliest defiler of the party's purity. All subsequent crimes against the party, all treacheries, acts of sabotage, heresies, deviations sprang directly out of his teachings. Somewhere or other, he was still alive and hatching his conspiracies. Perhaps somewhere beyond the sea, under the protection of his foreign paymasters, perhaps even so, it was occasionally rumored in hiding places in Oceania itself. All right, give me a second. Back. Very quickly, I read that new Ordeal chapter, Peak, as always. Anyway, okay. Once his diaphragm was constricted, he could never see the face of Goldstein without a painful mixture of emotions. It was a lean Jewish face with a great fuzzy aureole of white hair and a small goatee beard, a clever face, and yet some inherently despicable with a kind of senile silliness. In the long thin near the end of which a pair of spectacles was perched, it resembled the face of a sheep, and the voice too had a sheep-like quality. Goldstein was delivering his usual venomous attack upon the doctrines of the party, in that an attack so exaggerated and perverse that a child should have been able to see through it, and yet just plausible enough to fill one with an alarm feeling that other people, less level-headed than oneself, might be taken in by it. He was abusing Big Brother. He was denouncing the dictatorship of the party. He was demanding the immediate conclusion of peace with Eurasia. He was advocating freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought. He was crying hysterically that the revolution had been betrayed, and all this in rapid polysyllabic speech which was a sort of parody of the habitual style of the orators of the party, and even oh my god, and even alright, I found it. Contain newspeak words, more newspeak words indeed than any other party member would normally use in real life, and all the while, lest one should be in any doubt as to the reality which Goldstein's specious claptrap covered behind his head on the telescreen. There marched the endless columns of the Eurasian army, row after row of solid-looking men with expressionless Asiatic faces who swam up to the surface of the screen and vanished, to be replaced by others exactly similar. The dull rhythmic tramp of the soldier's boot formed the background to Goldstein's bleeding voice. Before the hate had proceeded for 30 seconds, uncontrollable exclamations of rage were breaking out from half the people in the room. The self-satisfied sheep-like face on the screen and the terrifying power of the Eurasian army behind it were too much to be borne. Besides the sight or even the thought of Goldstein's produced fear and anger automatically. He was an object of hatred more constant than either Eurasia or East Asia. Eurasia and East Asia. Since when Oceania was at war with one of those powers, it was generally at peace with the other. What was strange was that although Goldstein was hated and despised by everyone, although every day and 1,000 times a day, on platforms, on the television, in newspapers and books, his theories were refuted, smashed, ridiculed, held up to general gauge for the pitiful rubbish that they were. In spite of all this, his influence never seemed to grow less. Always there was fresh dupe waiting to be seduced by him. A day never passed when spies and saboteurs acting under his directions were not unmasked by the thought police. He was the commander of a vast shadowy army, an underground network of conspirators dedicated to the overthrow of the state. The Brotherhood, its name was supposed to be. There was also whispered stories of a terror book, a compendium of all the heritages of which Goldstein was the author and which circulated clandestinely here and there. It was a book without a title. People referred to it, if at all, simply as the book, but one of such things was only through vague rumor. Neither the Brotherhood nor the book was a subject that any ordinary party member would mention if there was a way of avoiding it. In the second minute, the hate rose to a frenzy. People were leaping up and down in their places and shouting to the tops of their voices in an effort to drown the maddening, bleeding voice that came from the screen. The little sandy-haired woman had turned bright pink, and her mouth was opening and shutting like that of a landed fish. Even though Brian's heavy face was flushed, he was sitting very straight in his chair, his powerful chest swelling and quivering as the thought he were standing up to assault of a wave. Excuse me. The dark-haired girl behind Winston had begun crying out, "Swine, swine, swine." And suddenly, she picked up a heavy Newspeak dictionary and flung it at the screen. It struck Goldstein's nose and bounced off. The voice continued inexorably. In a lucid moment, Winston found that he was shouting with the others and kicking his heel violently against the rung of his chair. The horrible thing about the 2-minute hate was not that one was obligated to act as a part, but that it was impossible to avoid joining in. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was always unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, to torture, to smash face in with a sledgehammer seemed to flow through the whole group of people like an electric current, turning one, even against one, well into a grimacing, screaming lunatic. And yet the rage that one felt was an abstract, undirected emotion, which could be switched from one's object to another like the flame of a blow lamp. Thus, at one moment, Winston's hatred was not turned against Goldstein's at all, but on the contrary, against Big Brother, the party, and the thought police. And at such moments, his heart went out to the lonely, derided heretic on the screen, so guardian of truth and sanity in the world of lives, and yet the very next instant, he was one with the people about him. And all that was said of Goldstein seemed to him to be true. At this moment, his secret loathing of Big Brother changed into adoration, and Big Brother seemed to tower up, an invincible, fearless protector, standing like a rock against the horde of Asia and Goldstein. In spite of his isolation, his helplessness, and the doubt that hung upon him about his very existence, seemed like some sinister enchanter, capable by the mere power of his voice of wrecking the structure of civilization. It was even possible at moments to switch one's hatred this way or that by a voluntary act, suddenly by the sort of violent effort with which one wrenches one's head away from the pillow in a nightmare. Winston succeeded in transferring his hatred from the face on the screen to the dark-haired girl behind him. Vivid, beautiful hallucinations flashed through his mind. He would flog her to death with a rubber truncheon. He would tie her naked to a stake and shoot her full of arrows like Saint Sebastian. He would ravish her and cut her throat at the moment of climax better than before. Moreover, he realized why it was that he hated her. He hated her because she was a young and pretty and sexless, because he wanted to go to bed with her and would never do so, because round her sweet, supple waist, which seemed to ask you to encircle it with your arm, There was only the Odysseus scarlet sash, aggressive symbol of chastity. The hate rose to its climax. The voice of Goldstein had become an actual sheep's bleat, and for an instant the face changed into that of a sheep. Then the sheep's face melted into the figure of a Eurasian soldier who seemed to be advancing, huge and terrible, his submachine gun roaring and screaming to spring out of the surface of the screen, so that some of the people in the front row actually flinched backwards in their seats, but at the same moment, drawing a deep sigh of relief from everyone. The hostile figure melted into the face of Big Brother. Black-haired, black-mustachioed, full of power and mysterious calm, and so vast that it almost filled up the screen. Nobody heard what Big Brother was saying. It was merely a few words of encouragement, the sort of words that are uttered in the din of battle and not distinguishable individually, but restoring confidence by the fact of being spoken. Then the face of Big Brother faded away again, and instead the three slogans of the party stood out in bold capitals: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Let me get some more water. This is probably the longest I've read speaking like straight thoroughly. Anyway, we're almost But the face of Big Brother seemed to persist for several seconds on the screen, as though the impact that it had made on everyone's eyeballs was too vivid to wear off immediately. The little sandy-haired woman had flung herself forward over the back of the chair in front of her with a tremulous murmur that sounded like "My Savior." She extended her hands towards the screen. Then she buried her face deep in her hands. It was apparent that she was uttering a prayer. At this moment, the entire group of people broke into a deep, slow, rhythmic chant of "Buh, buh, 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 buh," and over again, very slowly, with a long pause between the first B and the second. A heavy murmured sound, somehow curiously savage, in the background of which one seemed to hear the stamp of naked feet and the throbbing of tom-toms. For perhaps as much as 30 seconds they kept it up. It was a refrain that was often heard in moments of overwhelming emotion. Partly it was sort of hymn to the wisdom and majesty of Big Brother, but still more of it was an act of self-hypnosis, a deliberate drowning of consciousness by means of rhythmic noise. Winston and Trail seemed to grow cold in the 2-minute hate. He could not help sharing in the general delirium, but this submarine chanting of "buh, buh, buh, buh" always filled him with horror. Of course, he chanted with the rest. It was impossible to do otherwise. To dissemble your feelings, to control your face, to do what everyone else was doing was the instinctive reaction. But there was a space of a couple seconds during which the expression in his eyes might conceivably have betrayed him. And it was exactly at that moment that the significant thing happened, if indeed it did happen. Momentarily, he caught O'Brien's eye. O'Brien had stood up. He had taken off his spectacles and was in the act of resettling them on his nose with his characteristic gesture. But there was a fraction of a second when their eyes met, and for as long as it took to happen, Winston knew, yes, he knew, that O'Brien was thinking the same thing as himself. An unmistakable message had passed. It was as though their two minds had opened and thoughts were flowing from one into the other through their eyes. "I am with you," O'Brien seemed to be saying to him. "I know precisely what you are feeling. I know all about your contempt, your hatred, your disgust, but don't worry, I am on your side." Then the flash of intelligence was gone, and O'Brien's face was as inscrutable as everyone else. That was all, and he was already uncertain whether it had happened. Such incidents never had any sequel. All that they did was to keep him alive in him the belief or hope that others besides him were the enemies of the party. Perhaps the rumor of vast underground conspiracies were true after all. Perhaps the Brotherhood really existed. It was impossible, in spite of the endless arrests and confessions and executions, to be sure that the Brotherhood was not simply a myth. Some days he believed in it, some days not. There was no evidence, only fleeting glimpses that might mean anything or nothing. Oh man. Snatches of overheard conversations, faint scribbles on lavatory walls once, even when the two strangers met, a small movement of the hand which had looked as though it might be a signal of recognition. It was all guesswork. Very likely he had imagined everything. He had gone back to his cubicle without looking at O'Brien again. The idea of following up their momentary contact hardly crossed his mind. It would have been inconceivably dangerous even if he had known how to set about doing this. For a second, 2 seconds, they had exchanged an unequivocal glance, and that was the end of the story. But even that was a memorable moment in the locked loneliness in which one had to live. Winston Port rose himself and sat up straighter. He let out a belch. The gin was rising from his stomach. His eyes refocused on the page. He discovered that while he sat helplessly musing, he had also been writing, as though by automatic action, and it was no longer the same cramped, awkward handwriting as before. His pen had slid voluptuously over the smooth paper, printing in large near capital. Down with Big Brother, 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 over and over again, filling half a page. He could not help a feeling of twinge of panic. It was absurd, since the writing of those particular words was not more dangerous than the initial act of opening the diary. But for a moment he was tempted to tear out the spoiled pages and abandon the enterprise altogether. But he did not do so, however, because he knew it was useless. Whether he wrote down with Big Brother or whether he refrained from writing it made no difference. Whether he went on with the diary or whether he did not go on with it made no difference. The thought police would get him just the same. He had committed, would still have committed, and even if he had never set pen to the paper, the essential crime that contained all others in itself, thought crime, they called it. Thought crime was not a thing that could be concealed forever. You might dodge successfully for a while, even for years, but sooner or later, they were bound to get to you. It was always at night. The rest inevitably happened at night. The sudden jerk out of sleep, the rough hand shaking your shoulder, the lights glaring in your eyes, the ring of hard faces round the bed. In the vast majority of cases, there was no trial, no report of the arrest. People simply disappeared, always during the night. Your name was removed from the registers. Every record of everything you had ever done was wiped out. Your one-time existence was denied and forgotten. You were abolished, annihilated, vaporized was the usual word. For a moment, he was seized by a kind of hysteria. He began writing in a hurried, untidy scrawl. They'll shoot me, I don't care. They'll shoot me in the back of the neck, I don't care. Down with Big Brother. They'll always shoot you in the back of the neck, I don't care. Down with Big Brother. He sat back in his chair, slightly ashamed of himself, and laid down his pen. The next moment, he started violently. There was a knocking at his door. Already, he sat as still as a mouse. The futile hope that whoever it was might go away after a single attempt, but no. The knocking was repeated. The worst thing of all would be to delay. His heart was thumping like a drum, but his face, from long habit, was probably expressionless. He got up and moved heavily towards the door. Okay, that's 2. Sorry if I read a little bit fast, but I was kind of rushing. I heard my parents coming up and down, and I think they're cooking, so I'm gonna go eat. Yeah, goodbye, and thank you for listening to me.